in case of a military action against an ally, it's dead. It's over. Our prime minister has said the same, and I don't see how you could argue that there's any value of an alliance if there's military action against someone who's supposed to be your ally. But I'm afraid the reality is that if you read Trump's national security strategy, there's no case to make really that NATO will be functional as long as Trump is in power.
Hello and welcome to the Trump Report. I'm Louis Sykes. As many of you will know, we've made some significant changes to this channel recently. You can head over to the Times' YouTube channel for Times Radio's regular live output, but stay right here for your usual updates from the Trump Report and Frontline. Now, on the Trump Report today, we are joined by Jacob Kaarsbo, a foreign security and defence analyst who spent 15 years in the Danish Defence Intelligence Service. Jacob, welcome to the Trump Report.
Thanks for having me. Thanks.
Well, there is a lot going on in the world of global security with the US and Denmark over Greenland, of course. I wonder if we could just start with your take on Trump's comments and this sudden flare-up of American interest in Greenland that we've seen at the start of this year.
Yeah, the comments really underline the intentions. I've harbored no doubts as to the intentions because it's been quite obvious with the actions that the US have carried out covertly that these were the real intentions, but now it's out in the open. And it doesn't seem to me that Trump intends on holding back.
And these comments from Greenland follow this flurry of American overseas and security activity. We've seen what's going on, obviously, in Venezuela with the kidnap of Maduro, the seizing of several Shadow Fleet vessels. Obviously, none of that is an inherent problem for European or Danish security, but there must be people who are feeling a bit more nervous that Trump is willing to put pretty significant action behind some of these harsh words.
Indeed, both in Denmark and in Greenland proper, there's a lot of nervousness, anxiety because of what's being said, and I'm afraid also, although we haven't had a big discussion in Denmark about military preparations, etc., they seem to be there as well. So they're well founded. This is the materialization of what we saw in the national security strategy and what's been called the Dunroe Doctrine about dominance in the Americas. And I'm afraid this is what Donald Trump seeks to carry through to the end.
So, Jacob, what do you see as the timeline from where we are today if the US does decide it's going to continue on this path of trying to secure Greenland for itself?
Yeah, I expect the first step to be tomorrow when our foreign minister, Lars Løkke, and the representative from Greenland will visit the White House. First, it was scheduled to take place at the State Department with the Foreign Secretary Rubio, but it was J.D. Vance wanted to come along, and now it's at the White House. And I'm afraid that will be what Donald Trump on Friday called the easy way. So there won't be negotiations. A lot of people in Denmark think there will be negotiations. I'm very skeptical that we'll be able to change their perspective. So this will be a fait accompli for Denmark, the easy way. There'll be an offer to buy Greenland, and because we can't sell Greenland, because it's the Greenlanders that decide, and they don't want to be sold. So we have to refuse it, and that's when we switch to the hard way, as Trump called it, on Friday. And that is probably something that will, in the end, entail a military attempt to take over Greenland if we cannot deter it. So I'm afraid that will be the sequencing. It's far too simple, actually, but that's the way Trump reacts, and that's what he's really lined up.
And Trump says this is a security issue for the US, and that's why he believes that the US needs to take Greenland as part of its own territory, as he put it. But what is the actual security situation in Greenland and the Arctic North more widely?
Yeah, I mean, if there ever was a red herring, this is it. Trump's claims of Russian warships are unfounded. We usually say there's one Russian ship around Greenland in summertime, and that's a cruise liner that carries Russian skiers to Greenland. And to my knowledge, none of them have had malign intentions. So this is just a red herring. This is about dominance of the Americas. This is about an attractive, in Trump's eyes, piece of land. It looks great on a map. It's huge. And also we have this whole issue of rare earths, natural resources, and I'm afraid also that Trump's backers in Silicon Valley play an important role in that strategy, because they've convinced him that this is the right way to go, because they see Greenland as an asset.
And it is worth noting that the US already has pretty extensive military access to Greenland, doesn't it?
Oh yeah. I mean, there's been a defense agreement in place since 1951, and Greenland is part of NATO, and there have been no efforts whatsoever to have a dialogue about increasing the military presence. Denmark and other NATO allies in Greenland. So this also illustrates that, as I said, it is a red herring. And if you look at it even more in depth, you can also see that the US themselves have actually decreased their presence radically over the years, and is now only in place in the very north at the Pitovik space base, where they really, under the agreements, they could just ask Greenland and Denmark for more of a presence, and this has nothing to do with ownership, but Trump wants to own Greenland. That's it.
And for some of our audience abroad who might not be as familiar with the history of this island, what is the connection between Denmark and Greenland and the history behind that? And has the US ever had any more significant involvement than it has at the moment?
No, it's been part of the kingdom for hundreds of years, and as with all territories abroad, I guess there are grievances. Also between Denmark and Greenland, there's no hiding that. But Greenland and Denmark are working to sort that out. And there are absolutely no indications that the vast majority of the Greenlandic people want to do anything else than be part of Denmark. They have an explicit wish to become independent one day, but that's between the Greenlanders and Denmark, and it is really the Greenlanders that make that decision. Of course, in defense and security, there are issues because the population is only 57,000. So how could they stand on their own 2 feet? But again, as I'm saying, when Trump brings that up, there are no plans for independence on the table, and this is a red herring about a Russian or Chinese takeover. That's just not reality.
And do you think the situation as it stands at the moment would change if Greenland does go independent? And is Greenlandic independence a realistic prospect imminently?
No. I mean, it was actually more realistic before the United States started threatening it. And now the Greenlanders can see for themselves what independence might entail. So, if there is a wish to get even more home rule, the main problem is still foreign security and defense policy, because how could they sustain that independence without some arrangement around that? And since the U.S. is the strongest part of NATO, and with Trump going the way he is, it seems unfathomable that that could be sorted out in a NATO setting, which would have otherwise been the natural way to do it.
The US is reportedly considering paying $100,000 to each Greenlander if the island were to agree to join the US. How do you think that's being read in Greenland? Is there any perception that that's something the people of Greenland would go for?
There are no indications that the Greenlanders think that they should sell themselves. There's been, as I was saying, quite a few ruptures back and forth in the Danish-Greenlandic relationship. But after Trump came to power and started really pushing for this, and also starting subversive activities against Greenland and the Kingdom of Denmark, Greenland and Denmark have moved closer together, and there's much more alignment between the two governments than there have been for years.
And Trump has said in recent days he won't rule out military action in Greenland. He says we can do this the easy way or the hard way, a lot of pretty tough language. But he's also said that Greenland has 2 dog sleds, to quote him directly, as its defences. That's not really true at all, is it? How much has the security of Greenland changed even over the last 12 months?
Yeah, it has changed quite a bit, and there is increased presence up there, not only by Danish, but also French, German, and other European forces have been up there. There could be more done, definitely, from my perspective, but the strengthening of the dog sled component is a very small part of the increase in Danish defense expenditure in the Arctic and around Greenland, and those investments are coming through. So again, that's just another fake portrayal. I have to say to the listeners that this is actually as fake as some of the attributions and reasoning that Putin uses to take over Ukraine. If you compare the arguments, it's much of the same, unfortunately.
And speaking of President Putin, the Russians and the Kremlin will presumably be looking at this with pretty beaming smiles after what's been quite a tough start for them to 2026. Is this the kind of internal disagreement in NATO that Putin has been pushing for some time?
Certainly. And if you quote John Bolton, I would say they're probably drinking vodka straight out of the bottle in the Kremlin tonight, because this idea of a military action against an ally would simply ruin NATO. People can argue that it's already being undermined by Trump's actions, and just his mere statements are in a clear breach of the North Atlantic Treaty. For example, Article 1, just to mention one, and that's the reality of it. But in case of a military action against an ally, it's dead. It's over. Our prime minister has said the same, and I don't see how you could argue that there's any value of an alliance if there's military action against someone who's supposed to be your ally. But I'm afraid the reality is that, if you read Trump's national security strategy, there's no case to make really that NATO will be functional as long as Trump is in power. Yes, allied forces, including American forces, still do exercises together, and a lot of the command and control structures within NATO are still working. But in the event of a war, what would happen? That's the big question. If there is an attack against the Baltic nations by Russia, would the Americans really stand up? I certainly have my doubts. I don't think that's going to happen. It doesn't seem that way from what else Trump is doing and what is actually explicit in the national security strategy, that he sees the European countries as more of a problem than Russia. So there you go.
And I'm keen to talk more about the NATO alliance and the implication for wider European and US security if some sort of military action does happen in Greenland. But if you'll bear with me on this, I'm keen to work it backwards, if that makes sense, because in the first instance, what are Denmark's options if the US does decide on military action in Greenland, and if we do see American troops deployed to that island?
Yeah, if we react, then it's too late. That's why I'm saying we need to be proactive now and deploy a European force of European allies and Canada, not least, our major transatlantic ally, because that way we can hope to avoid it. We can hope to deter Trump. The first thing, if you do that, it's not against the US. It's to take the wind out of the sails of Trump's arguments that there is a threat from Russia and China that we cannot control. And then we have to see what Trump does then. But I have to say, with the way Trump is handling this whole business and the way he's reasoning, we also have to be clear-eyed, and if it comes to that, we have to be ready to shoot. But that will take more. But clearly, a force going in there, naval assets, Arctic assets from Denmark and European allies to make sure that the Russians and Chinese can't get anywhere near. That's the step one, and then we have to see what Trump is up to. The worrying thing, let me tell you that, is that the main Arctic capability that the Americans have, because they don't have a lot of Arctic capability, we should remember, that's the 11th Airborne Division in Alaska. They've actually been exercising offensive actions, takeover of enemy airports, etc. And there are not that many Arctic areas and that many Arctic countries that where that could be relevant, and Greenland is the only Arctic area where Trump has signaled an intention for offensive actions. So that's the worrying bit, that they have seemingly prepared the 11th Arctic or Airborne Division from Alaska to take over Greenland. But the Europeans have way more Arctic capability when you break down the numbers. But it seems to me still that Europe is afraid to act. But we'll see whether that remains the position.
Yeah, we did hear Mark Rutte speaking in Zagreb, Croatia on Monday about NATO's security in the Arctic Circle, talking about Greenland, saying it is a security issue for the alliance. They do want to take it more seriously. Do you think that's been reflected in NATO's actions, though? And if not, is there at least a sign that NATO is coming round to the idea that they are going to have to send more troops to Greenland?
Yeah, I think that's the realization. But ironically, there's been no dialogue within NATO where the Americans have said, you got to come up here to Greenland to help us because we see all these threats, etc., etc. That's not been the case, and that's what any ally would do. So we actually going around a little bit blindfolded and pretending, playing some kind of theater, because the real threat against Greenland is from America, and that's the problem, and that's where Mark Rutte. Well, what can you say? He's a civil servant at the end of the day, and mainly employed by the U.S. So he doesn't really portray the reality. But I mean, let's get along and have a NATO force, send it in there, and let's see what Trump has up his sleeve. Then I think that should have happened already, but it hasn't. But European and Canadian NATO countries should do that immediately, as I said, to deter Trump from carrying through his threats.
And we've talked a bit about what would happen to the NATO alliance if military action were to go ahead. But how much damage has already been done here, just in Trump openly talking about attacking a NATO ally? How close are we to already putting the NATO alliance under too much strain for it to recover?
Yeah, I mean, as I said before, I think it's already been broken. Really, it exists formally. Many years ago, Macron said he thought NATO was brain dead, and that's probably the case now, whereas it wasn't back then quite so. But because, as I said before, Trump violates, many of the articles in the treaty. And really, under American law, he can't do that because that would take a decision by the U.S. Senate of a 3/4 majority. But I don't know when the U.S. Senate will hold Trump accountable, and that's really the main danger here. That regardless of what the Senate does, it seems that Trump is still able to threaten senators, etc., and thereby escape these actions that they should have actually taken under American law.
So do you see a way back for NATO from this precipice? I mean, if Trump were to leave office, or when Trump is supposed to leave office at the end of his term, could that help? Is there something NATO could do now to try and fix things from their end, to cool down some of the rhetoric we've heard coming out of the White House? What should they be looking to do now?
No, I think I've called for many years that Europeans should do more, and that the Europeans should be able to act independently within the NATO realm, and that discussion has been taking place since the early 90s, actually. And America has always called for Europe to do more, but America didn't want Europe to be able to do things independently. But now we're in a position where we must. The big question really is, how can Europe become, that operative entity, military speaking, or in military terms, and then keeping America on board, which we would all like to see. But the big question is, can we keep this going along for another 3 years at least? And who knows what will happen with the U.S. democracy itself? So the outlook is bleak, I have to say.
And there are European nations considering sending more troops to Greenland. The UK is apparently discussing the idea at the moment of sending its own troops there. We were talking yesterday, before, of course, this podcast, about the role of the military as a deterrent rather than a threat in these situations. What message do you think European deployments of troops to Greenland would send right now? And is it necessarily actually a step towards conflict, or is there another role for the military in this?
I see it as a deterrent, and we should be very clear that we are there to deter Russia and China and if need be, the US, and then hope, because you prepare for war to avoid war. And that's what the old Romans said, and that's still the truth. And the less we prepare, the more the risk will rise. So I think we shouldn't hold back. I quoted John Bolton before. Yesterday, he was out saying that it could be escalatory, but it's always the aggressor that decides on the escalation. I mean, we would only go to Greenland to defend Greenland and to defend the order. And whether that is against China or Russia or whoever, doesn't really matter. It's the aggressor that decides whether there's going to be war. So, I mean, the best we can do to preserve NATO and to preserve international order in our part of the world is by sending a potent force, and then we can hope that Trump stays away. But I don't see any negotiations that can really, any diplomacy that could really put this off the rails again, because Trump minds seems fixed on hoisting the stars and stripes above Greenland, and I don't see any other options than putting this force in there, as I said, against Russia and China, as Trump alleges. And if Trump wants to come with the 11th Airborne, we hope we can convince him that they'll come back in body bags, and then he'll stay away. But there are no guarantees. He seems to me to react and have a same idea of the world than like President Putin, and that's probably the unfortunate reality we are stuck with now.
Well, Jacob, this is a really fast-moving story, so I'm sure we'll be back on with you to discuss this further. And if our audience want to hear more from Jacob in the meantime, there is a Substack of his that you can read. There will be a link to that in the description. But Jacob Kaarsbo, foreign security and defence analyst and a veteran of the Danish Defence Intelligence Service, thank you very much for joining us today on the Trump Report.
Thanks a lot for having me. Thank you.